Isabella Laurent never imagined that the woman who spent 3 years silently polishing her vanity would be the one to shatter her reflection. Across the vast, shadow-choked expanse of the master walk-in closet, the air is thick with the scent of expensive leather and the sharp, ozone tang of a storm breaking. Isabella stands frozen, her voluminous dark waves disheveled and her form-fitting deep red evening gown torn at the thigh, symbolizing the exact moment her control unraveled. She is clutching a silk pouch of diamonds like a holy relic, her hazel eyes wide and swimming with a cocktail of panic and guilt. But it isn't her husband's shadow looming in the doorway, it is Evelyn Okoye. The maid stands with a composure that makes the room feel small, her simple gray uniform a stark, grounded contrast to the chaotic luxury surrounding her. In her hand, a smartphone glows with a cold, digital light, a modern-day Pandora's box. He isn't waiting at the private airstrip, Isabella. Evelyn's voice is a low, steady vibration that cuts through the frantic thumping in Isabella's chest. She tilts the screen, revealing a graining, high-angle video of Adrian Cross, the man Isabella thought was her knight in shining armor, sitting in a dimly lit warehouse, laughing with a man whose face represents everything Isabella was trying to flee. Adrian didn't fall in love with you. He fell in love with the wire transfer codes you've been bleeding from your husband's accounts for 2 years. Right now, he isn't planning a life with you in Tuscany, he's negotiating your trade-in value to the rival cartel. Isabella's breath hitches, the smudged lipstick on her mouth trembling as the escape fantasy she built her life around turns into a jagged trap. She looks at the faint scratches on her arm from her desperate packing and realizes they are nothing compared to the wounds Adrian has been preparing to inflict. Then, the heavy, mechanical hum of the electronic front gates echoes through the mansion, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. The sound is a death knell. Park Tae-woo is home 3 hours early. The quiet danger of the Empire has returned from the Crimson Gala, and the silence that follows his engine cutting off is more terrifying than any scream. His footsteps on the marble stairs are slow and rhythmic, the sound of a predator who doesn't need to hurry because the exits are already sealed. In this heartbeat, the polished, elegant Mafia wife vanishes, replaced by a woman caught between a husband who will kill her for the theft and a lover who has already sold her soul. Evelyn steps forward, her sharp, observant eyes locking onto Isabella's. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide if you want to be the victim in Adrian's story or the partner in mine. Tell me what you want, Isabella, the lie that's killing you, or the truth that might let you survive the night? Whatever Isabella says next will decide if she walks out of this mansion or becomes a permanent part of its foundation. But how did the most envied woman in the city end up draining a criminal empire for a man who viewed her as a transaction? To understand the blood that is about to be spilled and the nightmare Isabella is waking up to, we have to go back exactly 48 hours. Before we dive into the fallout of this high-stakes betrayal, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, if you found out your escape was actually a setup. Would you confess to the monster you're married to, or try to outrun the one you love? Stay tuned, because the shadows in this house are about to start talking. 2 days ago, the Laurent Park estate was a masterpiece of clinical perfection. The sun hit the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, illuminating a life that looked like a dream but felt like a tomb. Isabella sat at her mahogany vanity, watching Tae-woo in the mirror as he adjusted his black tailored suit. He was a man of sharp facial structures and even sharper silences, a husband who provided diamonds but never warmth. As she watched him, Isabella was secretly verifying the final $5 million transfer to an offshore account, her heart racing with the adrenaline of the theft. She saw herself as a ghost haunting her own life, unaware that Evelyn, moving silently in the background with a tray of tea, was the only one truly seeing her. In this world of high-fashion noir, every silk thread is a leash, and every diamond is a bribe. Isabella thought she was the architect of her own freedom, but as the clock began its 48-hour countdown, she was merely the last person to realize that in a house of secrets, the person who holds the camera holds the power. The air in the Laurent Park penthouse was always 3 degrees too cold, a clinical chill that preserved the expensive art and suppressed any hint of human warmth. Isabella sat at her mahogany vanity, her long, dark waves cascading over shoulders that felt weighted by the invisible pressure of the ceiling. In the mirror's reflection, Park Tae-woo stood behind her, a tall, lean silhouette in a black tailored suit that seemed to absorb the morning light. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. His presence alone was a silent command for order. He reached down, his long fingers grazing the column of her neck as he fastened a diamond choker, the gilded leash, that marked her as his most prized acquisition. The stones were heavy, cold, and flawless, much like the man holding them. Taewoo's eyes met hers in the glass, calculating, unreadable, and devoid of the passion she had once mistaken for protection. He wasn't looking at a wife, he was auditing a portfolio. To the world, she was the queen of the empire, but as his thumb pressed firmly against her pulse point, she felt like a bird being checked for a broken wing before being shoved back into a cage. The Crimson Gala requires perfection, Isabella, he murmured, his voice a low, smooth rasp that sent a shiver of genuine dread down her spine. Do not disappoint the family tonight. When he finally retreated, the silence he left behind was louder than any shout. Isabella waited until the soft click of the heavy mahogany door signaled his departure before her hands began to tremble. She reached into her makeup drawer, pulling out a hollowed-out vintage compact that held not powder, but a sleek, encrypted burner phone. Her breath came in short, jagged hitches as she pulled up the secure offshore portal. This was the first leak, the beginning of the end. With a few practice taps, she initiated a transfer of $500,000, a drop in the ocean of Taewoo's vast wealth, but a tidal wave for her future. She watched the loading bar with a mix of nauseating terror and intoxicating hope. In her mind, she saw Adrian Cross's warm eyes and heard his rugged, charming voice promising her a life where she could breathe without permission. She didn't see the spy or the snake, she saw the exit sign. As the screen flashed transfer complete, she felt a momentary surge of power. She was draining the monster, one pixel at a time, for the man who promised to save her. In the corner of the room, Evelyn moved silently, replacing the used towels with fresh, white linens. She didn't look up, her dark skin poised and her expression unreadable. To Isabella, the maid was just part of the furniture, an invisible fixture in a house of stone. Isabella tucked the phone away, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips, unaware that in this house, even the walls were watching, and the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the man who owned the empire, but the woman who saw everything he missed. The air in the boutique hotel suite smelled of sandalwood and the faint, metallic tang of rain-slicked asphalt outside. It was a sanctuary of shadows, 3 blocks away from the surveillance cameras of the Laurent Park estate and a world away from the cold marble silence Isabella called home. Adrian Cross stood by the window, his silhouette rugged against the city lights, the casual luxury of his linen shirt a sharp contrast to the suffocating black suits of Taewoo's world. When he turned, his warm brown eyes seemed to hold the only sincerity Isabella had ever known. Another 2 million cleared the ledger this morning, Isabella whispered, her voice trembling with the vertigo of her own daring. She moved into the circle of his arms, leaning her forehead against his chest. To her, this wasn't just a theft, it was the slow, methodical dismantling of a prison. Every dollar she bled from her husband's empire was a brick she was laying for their new life. Adrian's hands were large and calloused as they cupped her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "You're doing so well, Bella," he murmured, his voice a rugged velvet that promised safety. "A few more transfers during the chaos of the gala, and we'll be across the border before Taewoo even realizes his vault is empty. No more shadows. No more fear." Isabella closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the escape fantasy he had crafted for her. She saw them in a villa on the coast, far from the reach of the Korean Mafia, where her hazel eyes wouldn't have to scan the room for threats. She truly believed he was the architect of her freedom, the soulmate who had seen the girl behind the Mafia wife title and decided she was worth the risk of a war. She ignored the way his eyes remained sharp and calculating even as he kissed her, mistaking his focus for protective intensity. Together, they pored over the digital maps and encrypted account numbers on a tablet, the blue light reflecting in their eyes like a shared dream. They were the architects of ruin, planning to leave the Laurent Park legacy in ashes. Isabella didn't notice the way Adrian's fingers lingered a second too long on the total balance of the offshore account, or how he never quite looked at the photos of their future home, with the same hunger he looked at the wire transfer confirmations. To Isabella, the plan was a masterpiece of love. She was a woman who had spent years being owned, and in her desperation to be free, she had handed her heart and her fortune to a man who saw her as the ultimate payday. She was the one providing the capital for her own kidnapping, fueled by a hope so bright it blinded her to the snake coiled in the center of her sanctuary. In the house of Laurent Park, Evelyn Okoye was more than a maid, she was the ghost in the machine, a silent curator of a crumbling dynasty. She moved through the vast, echo-filled corridors with a poise that bordered on the invisible, her simple gray uniform a shadow against the gleaming white marble. To Isabella, Evelyn was a fixture of domesticity, as unremarkable as the mahogany furniture or the silk drapes. But while Isabella was blinded by the sun of her own desperate hope, Evelyn lived in the shade, where the truth was easier to see. Evelyn was the one who gathered the evidence of a life being dismantled from the inside out. She was the one who wiped away the smudged lipstick from Isabella's mouth after a migraine had kept her out until 3 a.m, lipstick in a shade of coral that Isabella never wore, a color that tasted of sandalwood and boutique hotels. She was the one who carefully mended the slight tear in the deep red evening gown, her fingers tracing the jagged silk and recognizing it not as a sign of Taewoo's violence, but as the mark of a woman fleeing a room in a hurry. From the corners of the room, Evelyn watched the gilded leash tighten. She saw the way Taewoo's cold, unreadable eyes followed his wife, not with the heat of a lover, but with the clinical precision of a man who knew his vault was leaking. She saw the burner phone hidden in the vintage compact and heard the muffled, frantic whispers of a woman who thought she was being saved. But Evelyn saw what Isabella's willful blindness refused to acknowledge: Adrian Cross was not a savior. Evelyn had seen Adrian before, long before Isabella had met him in that rainy cafe. She had seen him in the digital debris of the rival cartel's correspondence, a ghost she had tracked through the household's encrypted servers while polishing the office hardware. She knew the way his rugged charm was a calculated mask, a corporate weapon designed to find the fracture points in an empire. While Isabella was bleeding the accounts dry for love, Evelyn was watching the digital breadcrumbs Adrian was leaving for Taewoo's enemies to follow. She stood in the shadow of the hallway as Isabella laughed softly into her phone, a sound of genuine joy that felt tragically out of place in a house of stone. Evelyn didn't feel pity, she felt the cold, hard weight of leverage. She knew the truth long before the first wire transfer was ever flagged. She knew that Isabella wasn't running toward a new life, but toward a slaughterhouse. As she smoothed the white linens over the bed, Evelyn's sharp, observant eyes remained emotionally controlled. She wasn't just a witness to the ruin, she was the only one in the house who knew exactly when the roof was going to fall. The night of the Crimson Gala arrived like a funeral shroud draped in silk. Outside the penthouse, the city was a blur of rain and neon, but inside, the silence was sharp enough to draw blood. Park Taewoo stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, his black tailored suit cutting a lethal silhouette against the glass. He didn't look at Isabella as she lay on the chaise longue, a damp cloth pressed to her forehead, her hazel eyes squeezed shut in a practiced display of agony. To him, her migraine was a domestic inconvenience, a flaw in the evening's choreography. He adjusted his cufflinks with clinical precision, the metallic click echoing through the room like a hammer cocking on a pistol. "Rest, Isabella," he murmured, his voice a cold, low vibration that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. "The Empire does not stop for a headache, but I expect you to be recovered by morning." He didn't kiss her, he simply exhaled a breath that smelled of expensive scotch and left, his footsteps fading down the marble hallway until the heavy mahogany door thudded shut. The moment the electronic gates hummed closed behind his motorcade, Isabella bolted upright. The migraine vanished, replaced by a feverish, electric desperation. Her hands shook as she retrieved the vintage compact from its velvet hiding place. This was the final bridge. The air in the room felt thin, suffocatingly tight, as she logged into the encrypted portal one last time. $10 million, the final, massive hemorrhaging of the Laurent Park fortune, sat waiting in a digital queue. She stared at the send button, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. In her mind, she could already hear the hum of the getaway car's engine and feel Adrian's hand in hers, pulling her toward a horizon where the sun didn't set on a cage of stone. She thought of the architect of ruin waiting for her at the docks, his rugged charm the only thing keeping her from collapsing under the weight of her own treason. With a finger that felt like lead, she pressed the screen. The loading circle spun, a taunting, hypnotic loop. Processing. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. Then, a soft chime. Transfer complete. The empire was officially drained. The vault was a hollow shell, and Isabella was finally, legally, a ghost. She let out a sob of jagged relief, unaware that miles away at the gala, a silent alarm had just pulsed red on Taewoo's private server. She was a woman who believed she had just bought her soul back, standing alone in a dark room, while the digital breadcrumbs of her love led the monster straight back to his den. The penthouse was a tomb of silent marble, illuminated only by the cold, rhythmic pulse of the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Isabella moved with a frantic, animal energy, her deep red evening gown swishing against the floor as she tore through her walk-in closet. The migraine had been replaced by a jagged, electric high that made her hands tremble as she stuffed a silk pouch with raw diamonds and a stack of untraceable passports. She didn't need the couture or the heirlooms, she only needed the weight of the exit in her palm. Every zip of the suitcase felt like a stitch in the shroud she was wrapping around her life as Park Tae-woo's wife. She was a ghost now, a shadow dancing on the edge of a new world. In her mind, the $10 million she had just bled from the empire was already transformed into the salt air of a Mediterranean coast and the warm, rugged touch of Adrian Cross. She checked the burner phone, one final text from him: "The boat is idling. 5 minutes, Bella. Don't look back." The adrenaline was a roar in her ears, drowning out the moral vertigo of her theft. She had won. She had outplayed the most feared man in the city, and she was seconds away from the servants' entrance where the getaway car waited in the rain. She grabbed the handle of the small leather bag, her knuckles white, and pivoted toward the door. But as she stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the air suddenly turned 3 degrees colder. A tall, thin shadow stretched across the polished floor, cutting off her path like a physical barrier. Isabella froze, her breath hitching in a jagged sob of surprise. Standing in the mouth of the service corridor was Evelyn Okoye. The maid was perfectly poised, her hands folded neatly over her white apron, her dark skin luminous in the half-light. She didn't look like a servant, she looked like a judge. "The gates have already hummed open, Isabella," Evelyn said, her voice a low, clinical vibration that stopped the blood in Isabella's veins. "And Tae-woo isn't the only one coming for what's left of this house." Isabella tightened her grip on the bag, her hazel eyes darting toward the exit. "Move, Evelyn. I don't have time for this. I'll make sure you're taken care of, just let me pass." But Evelyn didn't move. She simply raised her right hand, holding a smartphone that glowed with a cold, digital light. "You're running toward a cliff," the maid murmured, the blue light reflecting in her sharp, observant eyes. "And Adrian is the one who's going to push you." The sound of heavy tires crunched on the gravel driveway below, a low, rhythmic growl that signaled the return of the monster. Isabella looked at the glowing screen in Evelyn's hand and then at the dark hallway, realized that the shadow she had spent years ignoring was the only thing standing between her and a grave. The blue light from the smartphone screen bled into the dim hallway, casting jagged shadows across Isabella's pale, terrified face. Outside, the low, rhythmic growl of Tae-woo's motorcade grew louder, but inside, the silence was a vacuum. Evelyn didn't speak, she simply swiped her thumb across the glass, and the digital poison began to leak into the room. The video was grainy, a high-angle shot from a hidden camera in a warehouse Isabella didn't recognize. There was Adrian. He wasn't the architect of ruin she had fallen in love with, he was a stranger. The casual luxury of his linen shirt was the same, but his rugged charm had sharpened into something clinical and cruel. He was sitting across from a man with a scarred throat, a known lieutenant for the rival cartel Tae-woo had been at war with for a decade. "She's already drained 10 million, Adrian's voice came through the tiny speakers, stripped of its warmth. He was laughing, a dry, hollow sound that made Isabella's stomach lurch. "She thinks we're heading for a villa in Tuscany. She's packing the diamonds now. I'll bring her to the border by midnight. You get the girl to use as leverage against Tae-woo, and I get the offshore codes. Everyone wins." The man with the scarred throat leaned in, his voice a gravelly rasp. "And if she resists?" Adrian didn't hesitate. He took a slow sip of bourbon, his eyes cold and transactional. She won't. She's so desperate to be saved that she'll walk right into the crate herself. By the time she realizes the boat isn't going to Italy, the papers will already be signed. Isabella's world didn't just break, it atomized. The suitcase in her hand hit the marble floor with a dull, hollow thud, the diamonds inside clicking together like teeth. Her hazel eyes were fixed on the screen, watching the man she had called her soulmate negotiate her market value, as if she were a piece of livestock. The nightmare realization settled into her bones with a paralyzing chill. She hadn't been planning an escape, she had been funding her own kidnapping. Every wire transfer, every secret kiss, every whispered promise of freedom had been a digital breadcrumb leading her toward a slaughterhouse. "He was never yours, Isabella," Evelyn said, her voice a calm, steady vibration against the frantic ringing in Isabella's ears. She took a step closer, the glowing phone still held like a weapon. "He was the rival spy, sent to find the fracture in Taewoo's house. And you gave it to him." Below, the heavy mahogany front door groaned open. The quiet danger was back. Isabella looked from the screen to the dark stairs, caught between the monster she had robbed and the snake who had sold her. The adrenaline of the flight was gone, replaced by a suffocating, dark noir despair. She was a woman standing in the wreckage of her own hope, realizing that in a house built on blood, the only thing more dangerous than the man who owned you was the man who promised to set you free. The mechanical groan of the garage doors vibrated through the floorboards, a low-frequency tremor that seemed to rattle the very diamonds inside Isabella's fallen suitcase. The quiet danger had returned, and with him came a silence so heavy it felt like the air was being sucked out of the hallway. Isabella stood paralyzed, the blue light of Evelyn's phone still reflecting in her wide, glassy eyes. She could hear the rhythmic, clinical thud of a car door closing, a sound as final as a gavel. Then came the footsteps. Taewoo's gait was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of urgency. He didn't stomp, he glided over the marble with the terrifying patience of a man who knew that all the exits in his world belonged to him. Each click of his polished heels against the stone floor echoed up the grand staircase, a countdown to a reckoning Isabella was no longer prepared to face. The master was home, and he wasn't arriving as a husband returning from a gala. He was arriving as a king who had just discovered his treasury had been sacked. Isabella looked at the torn silk of her red gown and the smudged lipstick Evelyn had so carefully noted earlier. She looked like a woman caught mid-flight, a frantic bird mid-escape. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches, her hazel eyes darting to Evelyn, who remained as poised and unreadable as a statue in the shadows. "He knows," Evelyn whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the rising tide of Isabella's panic. The silent alarm at the gala didn't just flag the amount, it flagged the source. "He's not coming to ask questions, Isabella. He's coming to view the damage." The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused. The air in the hallway seemed to drop another 5 degrees. In the half-light, Taewoo's silhouette appeared, tall, lean, and imposing. He stood partially in the shadows, his black tailored suit blending into the darkness, leaving only the sharp, calculating angles of his face visible. He didn't shout. He didn't even look angry. He simply stood there, his unreadable eyes settling first on the suitcase at Isabella's feet, then on the glowing phone in Evelyn's hand, and finally on his wife's trembling form. The minimalism of his power was his most terrifying weapon. He didn't need to brandish a blade to signal impending punishment, his mere presence in the doorway signaled that the gilded leash had just become a noose. He reached up, slowly loosening his tie with a methodical grace that made Isabella's heart hammer against her ribs. The empire was drained, the lover was a traitor, and the monster was standing 5 feet away, waiting for her to explain why she was still breathing in his house. Taewoo stepped into the bedroom with the clinical grace of a surgeon entering an operating theater. He didn't look at the torn silk of Isabella's gown or the frantic rise and fall of her chest, his gaze anchored instead on the small leather suitcase lying discarded like a carcass on the marble. He moved to the mahogany sideboard, his tall, lean frame casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow the room's remaining warmth. The sound of crystal clinking against crystal, the pour of a single, amber scotch, was the only noise in the suffocating silence. 10 million, Isabella, he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that felt like a blade pressed against her throat. He didn't turn around. A predictable sum for a flight, but a heavy price for a betrayal. I assume the car is waiting? Isabella's mind was a frantic blur of static, but the cold weight of the digital poison Evelyn had just injected into her soul began to crystallize into a desperate, razor-sharp clarity. She looked at Evelyn, who remained positioned in the corner like a silent sentinel, the glowing phone still clutched in her hand. In that heartbeat, Isabella realized she was a pawn in a game where both the king and the knight intended to sacrifice her. She had to flip the board. "The car isn't for me, Taewoo," Isabella said, her voice cracking before she forced it into a hard, brittle line. She stepped toward him, ignoring the way her knees threatened to buckle. "It's a trap. And I'm the bait Adrian Cross used to lure your empire into a slaughterhouse." Taewoo paused, the glass halfway to his lips. He turned slowly, his sharp facial structure catching the moonlight, his eyes unreadable but narrowed. Isabella didn't wait for him to speak. She pivoted, gesturing toward Evelyn. "Show him," Isabella commanded, her hazel eyes flashing with a sudden, lethal desperation. "Show him what the architect was really building." Evelyn stepped forward, her movements poised and deliberate. She held the phone out to Taewoo, the grainy video of Adrian laughing with the rival lieutenant playing in a loop. Isabella watched her husband's face, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he watched the man who had been loving his wife negotiate her trade in value to his greatest enemy. "He didn't want the money, Taewoo. He wanted the breach," Isabella lied, weaving the truth of her theft into the fabric of a larger conspiracy. "He used me to find the fracture in your security so the rivals could move in tonight while you were at the gala. I didn't drain the accounts to run, I moved the funds to an untraceable offshore hub to keep them out of his reach once I realized who he was." It was a gamble of life-altering proportions. She was painting herself not as a thief, but as a double agent who had been caught in the crossfire. Taewoo looked from the screen to Isabella, the quiet danger of his presence intensifying. He set the glass down with a definitive click. He didn't believe her, not entirely, but the evidence of Adrian's betrayal was a fact he couldn't ignore. Isabella stood her ground, her smudged lipstick and torn dress now acting as the costume of a survivor rather than a fugitive. She had just handed Taewoo a target more satisfying than herself. The penthouse air no longer felt like a tomb, it felt like a command center. A week had passed since the night of the Crimson Gala, 7 days since the quiet danger had walked out of the bedroom with a phone full of digital poison and a list of GPS coordinates. Adrian Cross had disappeared into the gray fog of the Chicago industrial district, a ghost story whispered among the syndicate's lower ranks. There had been no police reports, no news headlines, and no frantic texts. There was only the heavy, absolute silence of a man who had been erased from the ledger of the living. Isabella sat at the head of the long, mahogany dining table, the morning sun striking the polished wood like a blade. She was draped in a high-necked black silk dress, her dark brown waves pinned back with a precision that bordered on lethal. Her hazel eyes, once wide with the frantic guilt of a fugitive, were now as steady and unreadable as the marble floors beneath her feet. She wasn't looking for an exit anymore, she was looking at a spreadsheet. Beside her, Evelyn Okoye moved with the same poised, invisible grace that had once allowed her to blend into the wallpaper. But the gray uniform was gone, replaced by a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that signaled a shift in the household's gravity. Evelyn didn't wait for a command. She reached forward, her dark skin a striking contrast to the crystal decanter, and poured a stream of vintage Merlot into Isabella's glass. It was the same shade of deep red as the gown Isabella had torn during her failed escape, a reminder of the blood that had been spilled to buy this new piece. Taewoo sat at the opposite end of the table, his sharp facial structure silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He watched his wife not as a trophy to be guarded, but as a partner to be consulted. The $10 million had been returned to the Empire's accounts, but the access codes remained in Isabella's private vault. She had learned the most expensive lesson of her life: love was a liability that made you blind, but information was a weapon that made you untouchable. "The rival cartel's shipping routes have been redirected," Isabella murmured, her voice a calm, clinical vibration that carried through the room. She didn't look up from the tablet. And the offshore accounts are being restructured under a new shell company. One that Adrian didn't know existed. Evelyn set the decanter down with a soft, definitive click and took her place at Isabella's right hand. The new queen took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, the metallic tang of power finally replacing the bitter taste of fear. The golden cage was still there, but Isabella Laurent had realized that if she couldn't leave the prison, she might as well own the keys. The empire was being rebuilt, brick by digital brick, and this time, the architect was a woman who knew exactly how much every soul in the room was worth.